Welcome back to the Create Me Free podcast. My name is Catherine Versillo. I'm a writer and artist researching the complicated relationship between health and creativity. I have been working in this area for about 2 decades, starting from my lived experience of how health impacts my creativity. I've also done a ton of research, some education. I've done lots of interviews, and I have come up over time with a framework that I call creative health cartography, which is a means of mapping the ways in which health impacts creativity across 6 domains. It impacts our creative process, our content, our medium, our identity as artists, our productivity as artists, and our business or sustainability in creating artwork. Health impacts these in ways that are not necessarily negative or positive, but they may require adaptations from us. We are super resilient people and often make adaptations. Recognizing what the patterns are of how health is impacting us makes it a lot easier to make the adaptations that we want to in a conscious and intentional way. When I say health, I'm talking about all kinds of health impacting us. So physical health, mental health. I have a background in psychology, so I tend to focus on mental health, but physical health, but also financial health, social health, circumstance. So how health and circumstance impact our creativity across these different domains. This is what I study. This is what I help artists with. I offer a variety of different services and products, including the Creative Health Cartography Workbook, which is a workbook for helping you find these patterns. It's available on Amazon, but also I've been working through it in this podcast. So we are on podcast episode 6. If you haven't listened to the other ones, you might want to go back. And the first one is just an introduction to what this whole podcast is, but episodes 2 through 5 are really the bulk of the creative process. So we have talked about what creative process is. We have talked about some of the workbook exercises and what that looks like for me as I work through the workbook. We have talked about various artists and art history and a little bit of theory around the foundation of how I think about how creative process is impacted by health. And that's episodes 2 through 5. And now we're on episode 6. Episode 6 is our last episode specific to the creative process category. Next week, we will move into creative medium and how health impacts that. But for today, I just want to kind of say some of the things that I didn't finish saying in the other episodes that I wanted to make sure to mention or to expand upon from before. And I wanted to go through just a little bit the last parts of the Creative Health Cartography Workbook for this section so that you can kind of see, again, how I work through this stuff sort of in real time for myself. So let's see. I'm going to start with theory. So there's a little bit of theory that we either have not covered or that I've mentioned in the episodes or I mention in the workbook, but I don't really dig into. And I wanted to just give you a little bit more of that foundation in case you're not familiar with it, and to just give an understanding of the theoretical concepts, the big picture concepts that tend to inform my work, specifically in the area of creative process and how it's impacted by health. So I've got, I think, 3 of those theories, maybe. I'm not sure. But we'll get started. So Christine Miserandino and spoon theory. If you know the term spoonies, this is familiar to you. It's the idea. Well, I'll get into it. I do mention it in the workbook. In the workbook, I have small sections that share just a little bit of theory, and this is the one that I do have in there, I believe, for creative process. So spoon theory, it's originally the name of an essay that Christine published in 2003. She was at a diner with a friend who asked her what it was like to live with lupus. And you know, what we have around us sometimes is what we use to describe things or to create, right? So she created a visual for her friend. She reached across the table. She gathered all the spoons she could see that were around the table, and she handed them to her friend. It was 12 spoons. So she told her, okay, you have lupus. This is what you get. In the morning, you started today with 12 spoons. Everything you do costs you 1 spoon. Got dressed? That's a spoon. Take it away. You have 11 spoons. Making breakfast? A spoon, take it away. Had to go to work, and that could be several spoons depending on what is required to go into that. So she worked with her friend. Friend started spending the spoons, and by lunchtime, she was out of spoons. You don't get more spoons, not until the next day, not until you're replenished. metaphorically. Metaphorically, the next day replenish might actually be, later that day or several days or whatever recovery time is, depending on your condition. So this was an essay that just really caught fire. The chronic illness community, the disability community really started using it as a shared language to explain what it's like to live in a body that's not considered healthy or that doesn't behave in the ways that work in a culture that wants us to maintain productivity the same way every day. Go to school every day, go to work every day. It's a way to explain that when you have a body like this, you have a finite amount of energy, and this is non-negotiable, and you can't just generate more spoons at will. You don't get more energy at will. You don't push through. It's a myth that you can just push through again and again and be well. So spoon theory that it's a language that has been shared. It's not specific to creativity. It's just about energy and wellness. Speaking of pushing through, you could push through. Sometimes you can push through because you absolutely feel like you have to. But basically what you're doing then is borrowing spoons from tomorrow. So if I push, I used up my 12 spoons, I take 2 more spoons, they have to come from somewhere. They come from tomorrow's energy. So like I said, it's not about creativity specifically, but it really relates a lot to the creative process for many people with a variety of different health conditions, particularly with chronic illness. If your energy is finite and unpredictable, then a lot of the creative advice that's out there won't work for you. So time management frameworks, one example is the advice that asks you to get up every morning before the kids go to school and write for an hour, write 300 words every day. It's perfectly valid creative advice, except it doesn't work for a body that can't get up that day because it used up all its spoons already. So your energy, the energy resource isn't stable, and therefore a specific time management framework that relies on stable energy doesn't work. And what ends up happening a lot of times is that we shame ourselves into thinking that we should try harder. If we only were more productive, if we were only more consistent, then we would produce more. If I only did get up every day and write for 30 minutes, then I'd have so many pages by the end of a year. Theoretically, certainly true, but it's not true for us in these bodies. And framing that creativity should be that way isn't necessarily useful and can be damaging. So it's just the wrong framework. And that's just one example of how spoon theory applies to creativity and how it kind of underpins a lot of what I write about in creative process, or my thinking around it. My thinking is that we all have certain amounts of energy and certain flows of energy, and those are different for each of us, and they can be different for an individual one of us over time. And so that's it underpins a lot of what I think about, because I don't think in terms of time management, for example, in that way. When I'm suggesting exercises to people, I tend to be loose around suggestions like that because of an understanding of spoon theory. I wanted to talk about 4 types of creative capacity, and this relates to spoon theory or is adjacent to it. These are 4 different types that fluctuate on different schedules, and they serve different parts of the creative process. So they're physical, cognitive, emotional, and creative capacity. Physical capacity is what the body can do and how long it can do it. How long can it sit? How long can it stand? How long can it type? How long can it hold a paintbrush? How long can it dance, move through space? How long can it sing out loud? It's physical capacity is the easiest one to talk about because it's the easiest one to see, and the limits of it tend to be the most immediate. You can't trick yourself usually into once your body gives out, it gives out, right? Not always true. There are exceptions to all of this, but physical capacity is generally easily understood. Cognitive capacity, this is the clarity of your thought. So this is your working memory, your ability to hold complexity, your ability to work cognitively. So if you have a high cognitive day, a good cognitive day, you can hold a whole argument in mind. You can see where it's going. You can have multiple steps going on, and you can complete all this in a creative way. On a low cognitive day, middle of the argument, you lose the thread of what you're thinking. If you've been listening to this podcast for the past several episodes, you will notice that some days I have high cognitive and some days are lower. If it's super low, I'm not going to be working at all. But if it's mid level, I might still show up and do the podcast, but have a lot more ums and ers and trail off, and I don't know what I meant to say. Versus a high cognitive day where I really have a beginning, middle, end in mind, and I can digress and come back to it because I'm having strong cognitive capacity. So brain fog is a symptom of a lot of conditions, from COVID to I experience it through depression. There's just hormonal age related to things. There's all kinds of things that cause brain fog, which directly attacks cognitive capacity. Foggy brain, lower capacity. Emotional capacity. So this is your ability to access feeling and your ability to engage with emotionally difficult material. So there are days where there's types of work that in order to get there, you need to be going to vulnerable places. And if you're having a low emotional capacity day, that doesn't feel safe. And if it's not safe, your body's going to try to protect you, and you're not going to be able to do that work, or you will not feel well doing that work. Versus there are days or ways that that we can regulate our nervous system so that we can safely access emotional capacity and widen our capacity, and therefore do that more vulnerable work. Creative capacity is the last one, and it's a little bit different because physical, emotional, it's kind of clear in our health. But creative capacity is really our openness and receptiveness specifically to making. So are you available to do the creative work? Are you available to be surprised and curious, which are factors that come into being creative? Are you available for kind of flowing with the work instead of forcing it to happen the way that you wanted to? Creative capacity is all around the capacity of being able to open yourself to a state that is receptive to creativity. So these are 4 types of capacity, and they all fluctuate on their own schedules. So you might have high physical capacity. You can physically, your body can do it, but low cognitive capacity. Your brain just can't do it. And depending what kind of creative work you do, it might not matter that you have all the energy in the world to move your body if your brain can't think. You could have really high emotional and creative capacity and be like really emotionally and creatively open and ready to do the work, but physically and or cognitively, you can't do it. We tend to treat these all as one thing. We tend to think, oh, I'm having a bad day, and a bad day is low in all of those things. But usually for most people, most of the time, it's a mixed day. It's if you can pull out those threads and really recognize for yourself, oh, the symptoms of my health are impacting my physical or cognitive, then instead I'm going to do this low physical work that is more emotional, or, any variation thereof. Or if your work isn't working for a long time, you can think about how is your health impacting these areas, and then what can you do to shift that? So if your health is impacting your physical capacity, it might be that you need to shift the time of day you do work when you have more physical capacity or more spoons, so to speak. Or it might be that you need to work in shorter bursts, or you might need to switch to a medium that requires less physical output from you. You can make adaptations when you know what's really going on for you. So being able to parse out those different kinds of capacity can potentially be really useful. So that's kind of all related to spoon theory and capacity. And then another theory I wanted to talk about today is flow theory. And I do think I talked about this a little bit. So I love flow theory and I relate to a lot of flow theory and I talk about it a lot because there's a lot to be said, right, for being in the flow. And there's a lot of research around creativity and flow. So I never say his name right. I should have looked it up again, but Mihaly's the Hungarian guy who's known for flow theory. Um, I'm so sorry that I did not look up how to say his name and I never ever say it right. But he's known for flow theory from the 1990s. If you don't know who I'm talking about, you can look up flow theory and his name will be right there. Last name starts with CSI. Um, in 1990, his book described flow theory as a state of complete absorption in a challenging activity. And in that, self consciousness dissolves, time sort of dissolves or warps. Importantly, the inner critic goes quiet and you're just in the flow of it. And it's not always just in creative work in terms of art, but in terms of any activity. He developed what he called the experience sampling method as a means of studying this. And so he gave research participants pagers and they went off at random times throughout the day and they answered questionnaires thousands of times. And when he did that, he found that flow was rare. And I think it's kind of interesting, right? Because I don't know I mean, you've already been pulled out of flow by the pager. So even if you were in flow, maybe you weren't deep enough in it and you're distracted from it and your questionnaire reflects that. I don't know. It's an interesting thing to talk about. But in any case, what he found in that research was that flow was rare. Very few people were reporting it. So his research described flow as one available state among many with particular preconditions. It's not a standard people were hitting all of the time. But the popularized version of flow that came out later really didn't talk about how rare it was and how it's only one available state and how there are preconditions necessary to keep the state, to make the state possible and keep being in it. If you learned about flow theory broadly from pop culture writing about from him, through like creativity writing or podcasts or whatever, it's generally you learn that creative flow should feel like you're in the zone. And then there's all these theories about what practice gets you into the zone. And there's all these, try this, try that, which is, I mean, definitely try whatever you want to try that might work for you. But just want to point out that though there's a lot to be said for flow theory, it just also misses a lot. For artists with fluctuating health, it tends to create a mythology that can function as a slow shame engine, a way of shaming ourselves. So you try to do these exercises, you try to access the flow state, and you can't. And there might be many, many reasons. It could be that your body's in pain or your nervous system you're out of whack, you're out of your window of tolerance, you're in fight or flight. You might be taking a medication that it limits your ability to get into a certain state. So whatever it is, you can't get there because of your health. And then that's where the shaming comes in. You didn't try hard enough. You didn't commit hard enough. You didn't, something's wrong. Something's wrong with me. And then we feel shame and then we stop doing the creative work and we wonder why we can't get into flow. And then we beat ourselves up for not getting into flow. And when really flow is just one state and it's a beautiful state, but it's just one. There's a neuroscientific reason that flow is harder for some bodies to access than others. In a 2003 paper, Arne Dietrich proposed it's what's called the transient hypofrontality hypothesis. And the argument of this is that flow involves reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for self-monitoring, error detection, working memory, and analytical thinking. The self-dissolution that flow requires depends that this system that I'm talking about goes quiet. The inner critic goes quiet because the system that does the monitoring, that whole system has reduced activity. If you have a nervous system that is running in anxiety or hypervigilance, if you have a history of trauma, perhaps, then the prefrontal cortex does not go quiet so easily. If you have an inner critic that's always going, that could be one of the reasons. And that is frustrating, but it's adaptive. That's your body trying to protect you. So it's staying active, it's trying to stay alert to protect you. And asking the prefrontal cortex to deactivate and be quiet in a body that is doing it because it thinks it's protecting you, it doesn't work. Then you can't get into flow. Then you get frustrated that you can't get in flow. Then you're overthinking it, and then making the whole system worse. So flow, it's physiologically, it's in your brain, harder to access if you have anxiety or PTSD or chronic pain or many, many other conditions. It's not something you can overcome by doing certain exercises to get into flow. So flow is wonderful, but when we hold it up as the standard for what real creative engagement is, it asks those of us with health conditions to measure ourselves against something that just simply isn't possible for us, and therefore we come up short, and that doesn't feel good or serve us. Barbara Fredrickson, who is a social psychologist at the University of North Carolina, offers an alternative to flow theory that could possibly be useful in terms of creative process and health. It's called broaden and build theory. It argues that positive emotions, and these are named curiosity, interest, engagement, love, contentment, even positive emotions, broaden the available repertoire of thoughts and actions. They open creative possibilities. They do not ask you to dissolve the self in the frontal cortex in that way. You stay present. You don't get out of presence. You stay present. Your whole self is intact. And then this means creative access happens within the consciousness rather than in this flow state where consciousness is temporarily suspended. So for many of us who have fluctuating health, who have nervous system stuff, broaden and build is a better description of what ideal creative engagement might look like for us. Maybe we don't aim for flow or want flow or concern ourselves with that. We can be engaged, which is sometimes what we think of flow as. We can be engaged with the work that we're doing without flow in that sense, without turning that part of ourselves off. And another aspect that we might add to this is Ellen Dissanayake. And she's an American ethologist and a scholar of aesthetics who has argued across several books that the core human impulse behind art making is what she calls making special. It's taking something ordinary and marking it, elaborating it, and making it matter. She sees this behavior as a cross-cultural universal present in every human society that has ever been studied. It is present in children before we've taught it to them. It is present in contexts that don't have to do with professional art. And relevant to this conversation, it does not require flow. Making special does not require transcendence or treating something as special or trying to quiet the inner critic or trying to do anything. It's taking the ordinary, marking it, elaborating on it, making special. So you can be super tired and not able to access a lot of energy, or sick or a little out of whack with your nervous system, and you can still make special. You can find what's around you and be present to some degree and make special. And that is not lesser than the ideal state of flow, which is all that my point is here. It's that in creative process, we often tend to be taught or pointed to creative flow as an ideal state that we should be aiming towards. And just thinking about that, that's not the only option. So I'm going to talk about 3 artists who maybe work in ways that aren't representative of flow, just to give a little more example here. So from this framework, I'm kind of thinking about flow as a way of disappearing into your work versus these people who are really present for every choice of their work. They're fully awake to their work. So Agnes Martin was born in 1912 in Saskatchewan, Canada, and she navigated schizophrenia throughout her adult life, and her creative practice was organized around the condition in ways that she has described over time. And she described her creative practice as waiting. So she would not begin a painting until she could see it complete in her mind. She would envision it. The image of the entire completed thing had to arrive in her mind before she could work. The waiting sometimes lasted days, sometimes longer, and she called it discipline to wait for it. She wrote an essay in 1973 called The Untroubled Mind that is about waiting as the active part of the work. It's the discipline of remaining open without forcing anything. So in 1969, she left New York City. She packed up her truck. She drove west. She didn't know where she was going. She ended up in New Mexico. And even while she was there, she was waiting. She was not painting right away. She built a house. She hung out in New Mexico. She waited. And almost, like 10 years later, she started painting again. And that was probably her most famous work. The grid paintings that she's really well known for kind of came out of this. And what it demonstrates is that she has a fluctuating mind, and a creative life can be built around that. And there's many different ways that that can happen. And you don't necessarily need to shape who your process into some idealized other process. So she was just present and waiting and envisioning and being patient and situating her life in a way that left her open to when the work was ready to come. So she wasn't in flow. She was in waiting. It's different. One example. Toni Morrison is my second example here. So she worked as a book editor at Random House for 18 years. She was raising two sons, mostly as a single mother. And she was one of these people who woke up in the morning before the kids woke up, and she wrote in the morning. And she did that consistently. We can't all do that, but some people can, and she did. And for her, she didn't have hours and hours and hours of the day or different hours that she could work. That was the time she had, and she made it work. And she has described her writing process in interviews with great precision. She got up before dawn, she made coffee, she watched the light come in, and then she sat down and started writing. She did not wait for inspiration. She did not wait for the muse to show up. She just started writing. She said, "I always get up and make a cup of coffee while it is still dark. It's almost a ritual, and I drink the coffee and I watch the light come, and it is in that moment that I know what I need to do." Um, so there was a ritual that she utilized to get into a state of work, but the state wasn't necessarily flow. It was just the state in which, okay, it's time to work now. It's not necessarily going to flow, but I'm going to sit here and I'm going to work. And that worked for her. She wrote many of her famous earlier works in this way, made in fragments in those mornings, before she did the rest of her life. So she didn't have the luxury of trying to get into flow, I guess. And I don't know, maybe there were moments of flow for her. I'm not saying she never experienced creative flow. I'm saying that it isn't necessarily the gold standard of what we all need to look for before we sit down to do creative work. Audre Lorde is the last person I'm going to talk about here. So you probably know she's a poet, an essayist, an activist, and I have talked about her before here on this podcast. About 1978, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she underwent a mastectomy. And the year that followed that is documented in the Cancer Journals. It's the name of it. She was advised to wear a prosthesis, and she declined, and she wrote about that decision. She said she did not want to present an appearance of a wholeness that she did not have. Prostheses, she wrote, offers the empty comfort of nobody will know the difference. But it was very important to her that people know the difference. She was in her mid-40s when she wrote this. She was teaching, lecturing, writing, continuing to produce political poetry. And then 1984, a few years later, she was diagnosed with liver cancer. And this is the one that I talked about before. She wrote about it, and she looked at her creative process through the lens of illness. And that is documented in a work eventually that was called A Burst of Light. She continued writing, teaching, speaking until she could not do that anymore. And then she passed away in 1992. The point here is that she was not necessarily in flow. She was in illness. She was in pain. She was in treatment. She was present for all of that in the body, and very embodied work. It's almost like the refusal to disappear into flow is kind of a refusal to be invisible in a way. She was wakeful. They were all wakeful to their creative process. So wakefulness, presence, awareness, intentionality, these all have their own intelligence, as does flow. And one is not better than the other. Um, okay. So looking at my notes here, and I think I'm ready to kind of wrap things up. I think I've told you the things I want to tell you throughout this creative process section. And now I'm going to bring the health cartography workbook back out and maybe look at two exercises. Let's see. I'm going to look at, let's see. I have creative reflections in here. And so each section has 10-ish questions. This one has 11. Creative reflections. The idea is just that you get a journal or an audio or whatever format that you want to take to respond to these in your own time and reflect upon these questions as a way to look at your creative process and how it's impacted by health. So I'm just going to pull one out. So if you were with me for some of these earlier episodes, what I'm doing here is really just working through the workbook on camera in real time without having thought through it before to give you a sense of what it might be like to work through it. It's a little different because obviously if I was sitting here writing it on my own, I wouldn't be on the spot in the same way. So it's a little different, but I wanted to kind of give you a sense. So, what is the creative ritual you've abandoned that you miss the most, and why did you stop? For a while, I was waking up every day and creating a little bit of collage or a small collage. I woke up, had my coffee, and would make collage at that time. And it was feeling really good. It was feeling like a really, I don't know, a very creative way to ease into my day. And why did I stop? I got away from that. I just have a different routine now, and I guess I got away from that in part because it's probably silly, but a lot of my day and my rhythm and my routine is dictated by my dogs. I work from home, and there are times when they, need their walks and outside time, and it's very loud and difficult to work if I am trying to work during those times. So in the mornings, it's best for me if I stay in bed and do my initial work from bed to get started, because then they stay in bed and it's just quiet and chill. If I get up and take my coffee to the table and then I go start collaging at the table, then they get up and then the whole day kind of shifts. So honestly, that's probably a big part of why I stopped. But I do miss it. And I kind of want to think about bringing that back in. But that's interesting because it's a ritual I've abandoned, but not because of health, but because of circumstance and situation, but not because of health. So that's one question. And then some of these I can't do here. One, like a long one, is write a letter from your creative process to you. But these are just exercises and ideas that I offer to you through this workbook to give you an opportunity to think about your creative process in a different way. So, okay. What would your creative process look like if you stopped trying to fix it? What if it is not a problem to solve, but could just be whatever it is? What might it become? So I would say in a lot of ways, I've gotten better with this in terms of knowing that my health, as I said, it impacts my energy and my ability to, I can't do the same thing every day because I don't have the energy or wellness to do the same thing every day. So I might intend to record podcast episodes on a Tuesday, for example, but then Tuesday comes and I am not feeling well enough. I am not able to do that. And so I've gotten better at not trying to fix the process and just trying to understand what the process is and how the process is related to my health. But what would it look like if I stopped trying to fix it altogether? Because I definitely do try to force myself into things. I definitely try to be quote unquote productive. Um, so what's coming to mind as I write this is if my creative process if I stop trying to fix it, I think what would look different is I don't know. I don't know what would look different from the day to day, but I think what would feel qualitatively different is that there would be less anxiety and less fear. I tend to, particularly financially, if I don't work for several days, I feel a little frantic that I'm not going to make enough and therefore not going to earn enough and therefore not going to have enough, I suppose. Um, so that's an area I'm working through in my personal growth. It's an edge for me, a growing edge. But I would say that what would look different in my process if I stopped trying to change my process is that the fear and anxiety around whatever my process is would dissipate. Um, yeah. Um, Let me see what else is in here. So I think I'm going to leave the reflections off for there. Um, I was going to do one more thing, which is to look at what's already working for me. And I can't remember if I actually looked at this previously on one of the other episodes, but the question is what's already working in your process that's just this works. And I do feel like, I think I'm bringing this up because I do feel like my morning routine works for me, even though it's missing out that creative collaging part. And now that I'm thinking out loud about it, maybe I want to bring collage in like one day a week. That's not necessarily a work day, but that's a different, day, a day that has a different pace, perhaps, where I can wake up, yeah, in a different way. So, but overall, my morning routine actually does work for me. I believe it eases me um, in large part because as I'm waking up, I'm starting my routine for the day, and that is giving me time to wake up to how I actually am. So I don't just jump up and go into something. I'm sitting with what's actually what my actual capacity is for that day, and therefore my process can build around that for the day. I can adjust my day accordingly a lot of the time, not all of the time. Um, and then the last thing I want to talk about is every section ends with a category called Where This Connects. And all this is about is thinking about how this section relates to the other 5 sections that I present in the workbook. So how we've been looking at how health impacts creative process. And this asks, how might it be connected to creative medium, to creative content? So for example, how might the process that you use be connected to creative content? Does it block you from accessing certain content? So if your process doesn't take into account nervous system variations, then as we talked about with the self-protection, you might not be able to access more vulnerable content because your process isn't allowing you to do that. Another question in this is there the reverse of that? Is there any content that's blocking your process? So, um, yeah, I mean, I guess it's a different way of looking at a similar thing, I suppose. But is it the content that you're working on that's blocking the process entirely because it's too vulnerable? So do you need to work on other content for a time in order to get your nervous system into a state where you can then go back to the process that can work with that content? Looking at avoidance is a good way of kind of identifying these things. So is there content that you're avoiding? Is there a time of day you're avoiding working? Is there a medium you're avoiding? Is there part of the process that you're avoiding? When you see what you're avoiding, you can usually see that there's some kind of block there. And if you can identify which categories it bridges, you might be able to find a different way in. So that really wraps up the creative process section. So here we are. This is the Create Me Free podcast that is going through the Creative Health Cartography workbook. The goal here is to help you as a creative person understand some of the ways that different aspects of health impact different areas of creativity. And see different patterns that exist for you and solutions to problems you identify. So it's not about saying that you have a problem. It's about if you believe you have a problem and want something to be different in your creativity and your creative health, helping you look at it in different ways so that you can have the kind of creative health you would like to have. That's what we're doing here. This podcast is recorded primarily on Substack, createmefree.substack.com. And you can come to there and subscribe annually in order to support the work and have access to discounts and have access to the paid episodes that are behind the paywall and some other things. It's really appreciated. If you aren't able to do that, it is also appreciated if you go to Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all of those and hit that 5 stars review button so that other people can see that you are enjoying the content here. And yeah, that's it. I will be back next week and we'll start talking about what creative medium is and how our health impacts creative medium. So I'm looking forward to talking to you next week. Bye.